He was smiling when I walked in. That's what I remember most. Not what was on his desk. Not the papers he turned over too quickly. Not the way his hand pressed flat against a folder like he was keeping it from flying away. Just the smile. It was a second too wide. A beat too slow to arrive. I said good morning. He said good morning back. I put the mail on the edge of his desk the way I always did. He thanked me the way he always did. And I walked out. But I stood in the hallway for a moment. The air felt different. I don't know how else to say it. Like a room that's just been cleaned too quickly before guests arrive. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was imagining things. I went to my desk. I opened my laptop. I started my day. That's when I realized something was very wrong. My name isn't important. What matters is who I was in that house. When I was 13, my parents left. Not all at once. First my father, then my mother, then the version of home I'd known. Within 8 months, I was living with my uncle. My mother's older brother. A man who had built something from nothing. A property management firm that controlled 9 buildings across the city. Respected. Connected. Careful with his image. He took me in without making it feel like charity. That mattered to me then. I grew up in that house. I went to school, then college, then I came back and worked for him. Not out of obligation. I was good at the work. I handled administrative operations, correspondence, filing, lease management, contractor coordination. I knew the business inside out. For 15 years, he was the most stable person in my life. So when things started feeling wrong, I didn't want to trust the feeling. It started small. A contractor I'd worked with for 3 years, reliable, always on schedule, stopped returning my calls. When I mentioned it to my uncle, he said he'd switched vendors. He didn't look at me when he said it. Fine. Vendors change. Then I noticed a discrepancy in a maintenance invoice. A repair listed for Unit 4B in the Callaway building. I'd coordinated that repair myself. The invoice said $1,200. My records showed $600. I flagged it. My uncle reviewed it and said accounting had made a formatting error. It was corrected. Case closed. Fine. Errors happen. Then the third thing. A tenant, a woman who had rented from us for 4 years, always paid on time, sent a formal complaint to the city housing office. I only found out because I knew someone in that office. She claimed she'd been charged double her deposit upon moving out, and had been given no documentation. I went to pull her file. It wasn't in the system. I asked the office manager. She said my uncle had personally handled that account. She said it with a careful kind of flatness that people use when they don't want to say more. I went to my uncle. He said the woman had caused property damage. He said it had been handled. I said I couldn't find her file. He said he'd look into it. He never came back to me with anything. I sat with that for a week. I told my cousin, my uncle's son, who also worked in the business, what I'd found. He said I was stressed. He said his father was meticulous. He said maybe I'd misfiled something. Maybe. I looked at his face while he said it. He didn't quite meet my eyes either. So I stopped reacting. And I started watching. I started keeping a second set of records. Nothing dramatic. I already had access to everything. I just began making quiet copies. Every invoice that crossed my desk, I logged it separately in a personal spreadsheet. Date, amount, unit number, vendor, authorization signature. I did this for 3 weeks before I found the first clear evidence. It was a Tuesday. Quiet day. My uncle was at a meeting across town. I was cross-referencing vendor payments against our maintenance logs, something I did regularly as part of my job. Nothing unusual about it. The Meridian Building. Unit 7. A plumbing repair invoiced at $2,300 to a company called Vestal Contracting. I looked up Vestal Contracting. It had been registered 18 months earlier. 1 employee listed. The registered agent's name meant nothing to me at first. I wrote it down anyway. I ran the name later that evening on a state business registry. That same name appeared as a director on 2 other small LLCs. Both formed within the past 2 years. Both receiving payments from our company's vendor accounts. I went back through my new spreadsheet. I went back through every invoice I had access to. Vestal Contracting had been paid 11 times in 14 months. Every payment was between $1,500 and $3,000. Every payment was authorized by my uncle's signature. Not a single one appeared in the maintenance logs I kept. Meaning the repairs either didn't happen, or they happened at a fraction of the cost and the difference was being redirected. I pulled the tenant communication records for the units listed on those invoices. 3 tenants had complained about the same issues the invoices claimed to have fixed. 1 had filed a formal notice to our office. The notice was in the system. The repair invoice for the same issue, dated 3 weeks after her notice, was in the system too. But when I called the tenant, I told her I was doing a routine satisfaction follow-up. She said no one had come. She said she'd been told the repair was scheduled. She was still waiting. I sat at my kitchen table that night with my laptop and a legal pad. I wrote down what I had. Not what I suspected. What I had. Shell companies. False invoices. Payments to entities controlled by my uncle. Tenant funds collected and unaccounted for. Repairs billed but not performed. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a formatting error. I thought about the woman whose file had disappeared. The one who said she'd been charged double her deposit with no documentation. I thought about how many tenants had come and gone over 15 years. I thought about how long this might have been happening before I was in a position to see it. I thought about being 13 years old, arriving at his house with 2 bags and no plan. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that. I felt something go still inside me. Something that had been warm for a long time, just became very quiet. I thought about going to him directly. Laying it out. Asking him to explain. I knew what would happen. The records would be adjusted. The vendors would be restructured. My access would be quietly reduced. And I would be managed, carefully, the way he managed everything, until the problem I represented was neutralized. He had built a business on discretion. He was very good at it. Confronting them would have ruined everything. I gave myself 1 week to be sure. Not because I doubted what I had. Because I needed to be certain that what I brought to someone else was complete. I couldn't afford gaps. I spent that week documenting with the same care I'd given the business for years. Every invoice I'd flagged, I pulled its corresponding file. I cross-referenced vendor tax IDs. I pulled publicly available LLC registration records and printed them. I compared our internal maintenance logs against the complaint records I could access. I built a timeline, 18 months of billing activity, and marked every transaction where payment was made to a vendor with no corresponding repair confirmation. By the end of the week, I had a folder with 43 pages of documentation. I made 4 copies. One stayed on a USB drive I kept at a friend's apartment across the city. One I uploaded to a cloud account my uncle had no knowledge of. One I printed and kept in a locked box I'd had since college. And one I put into an envelope. That envelope went to an attorney. I hadn't met her before. I chose her specifically because she had no connection to my uncle, his firm, or anyone in his professional circle. She specialized in civil fraud and tenant protection law. I found her through a housing advocacy organization I contacted anonymously first, just to understand what I was looking at. I met with her on a Thursday morning. I told her I was an employee with access to financial records, who had discovered what appeared to be a pattern of invoice fraud and tenant fund misappropriation. I used careful language. I stated facts. I did not speculate. She read through the documents while I sat across from her. She asked 3 questions. Clear, precise questions about the authorization signatures, the vendor registration dates, and whether I had any communication records related to the affected tenant accounts. I had answers to all 3. She told me this was serious. She told me the documentation was unusually thorough. She told me what the likely next steps would look like: a formal complaint filed with the State Housing Authority, a referral to the Attorney General's office for the financial fraud elements, and a civil suit on behalf of affected tenants if enough could be identified. She also told me I needed to be careful about my own position. I was an employee. I had been given access to these records as part of my job. I needed to be sure I hadn't crossed any line in how I obtained them. I hadn't. Everything I'd accessed was within the normal scope of my role. I had taken nothing that wasn't already mine to see. I had simply paid attention. We filed the initial complaint on a Friday afternoon. Over the following 2 weeks, I went to work every day. I answered emails. I coordinated contractors. I put mail on my uncle's desk. I said good morning. He said good morning back. He came to my office once to ask if I'd had a chance to look into a vendor renewal. I said I was working on it. He nodded and left. My cousin asked me to lunch. We talked about a family gathering coming up in the spring. He seemed relaxed. Comfortable. Unbothered. Neither of them had any idea. The attorney had told me investigators would move quietly at first. Background checks. Financial record subpoenas. They would build their own case using mine as a foundation. They would not tip their hand early. I received a message from her on a Wednesday evening. Short. Professional. It said, "They are ready to move. Next week. You should know." I read it twice. I put my phone down. I made dinner. I watched something on television that I don't remember. I thought about a 13-year-old version of myself standing at his front door with 2 bags. I thought about trust. I thought about how long I had given him the benefit of every doubt. They thought it was just another day. It wasn't. It was a Monday. My uncle arrived at the office at his usual time, just after 9. He had coffee in his hand. He greeted the receptionist by name, the way he always did. He went to his office. He closed the door halfway, the way he always did. At 9:40, 2 investigators from the State Attorney General's office walked into the building. They were accompanied by a representative from the Housing Authority. They were quiet. They did not make a scene. They showed their credentials to the receptionist and asked to speak with the owner. I was at my desk. I did not go to the hallway. I did not watch. I heard his office door open. I heard low voices. A long pause. Then the door closed again. It stayed closed for 40 minutes. When it opened, my uncle walked out with them. He was not in handcuffs. Not that morning. But his face was a color I had never seen on it before. He looked, for the first time in my memory, like a man who had been caught in the middle of something and couldn't find the exits. My cousin arrived 20 minutes later, clearly called by someone. He walked past my office without stopping. The investigators spent the rest of the morning in the filing room with our office manager, who cooperated fully. She later told me she had known something was wrong for over a year, and hadn't known what to do with that knowledge. I left at noon. My attorney had advised me not to be present for anything beyond my normal workday routine, and to leave calmly if things became uncomfortable. I walked to a coffee shop 2 blocks away, and sat for an hour. Over the following 6 weeks, the case moved with a quietness I hadn't expected. There were no news cameras. No dramatic hearings. The Attorney General's office worked methodically. They subpoenaed financial records going back 7 years. They identified 31 tenants who had been overcharged, double-billed on deposits, or had repairs invoiced that were never performed. The total amount redirected through the shell companies was just over $280,000. My uncle's firm was placed under a compliance order. His business license was suspended pending the outcome of a civil enforcement action. 3 of the shell companies were formally dissolved. The state filed a civil suit for restitution on behalf of the affected tenants. A settlement was reached 4 months later. He did not admit fault, that was his attorney's doing, but he paid back the full amount plus penalties. The firm was restructured under external oversight. Several properties were sold. He did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that. Civil fraud at this level rarely ends there unless the prosecutor pursues it aggressively, and the Attorney General's office chose the path that would get money back to tenants fastest. I had known that was likely. It was not my goal to destroy him. My goal was to stop what was happening and to make sure the people it had happened to got something back. That part worked. I left the company the week after the compliance order was issued. I didn't make a speech. I didn't send a company-wide email. I submitted a formal resignation, gave 2 weeks' notice, and spent those 2 weeks finishing every outstanding task carefully and thoroughly, the way I always had. My cousin called me once. He didn't say much. He asked if I'd had a choice. I told him I had made a choice. There's a difference. He didn't respond to that. We haven't spoken since. My uncle sent me a single text message 3 months after everything settled. It said, "I hope you feel it was worth it." I read it. I thought about it for a day. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say that the last 15 years hadn't already said. He had taken in a 13-year-old and built something real between us. And then he had built something else, quietly, in the margins of that trust. And I had simply seen it. I found a new position within the year. A smaller firm. Straightforward work. Nothing complicated. I don't think about revenge when I think about what happened. I think about the woman whose file disappeared. I think about the tenants who waited for repairs that never came and didn't know why. I think about the fact that it stopped. That's enough. The evening after I received his text, I sat on my balcony for a long time. No music. No phone. Just the city at a distance, doing what cities do, moving, breathing, indifferent. That night, everything was quiet.